Okay, so looks like it's 2:30, so I'm going to go ahead and start. I do have a fair number of slides to go through, and so I think I've talked to everyone here, trying to understand who's actually with the state agency and is directly subject to the manual, who's viewing it as a best practice and things like that. And then also just kind of to give me a quick sanity check, like how many people here would consider themselves like technologists, like the people actually, leveraging technologies to meet this or understanding the technical requirements? Okay, a couple. And then how about mostly just kind of compliance side and interested in the wording and the interpretations of the standards? More. Okay, all right. So the way we're viewing this, so effectively I'm a nerd, right? So InfoSec practitioner, whatever you will. So from the engineering perspective, I'm generally doing either blue team or red team kind of work, right? So I'm actually the attacker, or simulating the attacker anyway, or I'm actually on the defender side. And so that's kind of my background and where I've been in the industry for more than 20 years. And so I'm kind of, the way I was viewing this and says, okay, talk about compliance, and I'm talking about this topic to people who are living and breathing this, from the kind of compliance perspective in general, not just this particular update that came out in January. So it'll be kind of interesting, but that's my take, is I want to do this kind of as a practitioner's perspective. If it gets too far in the weeds or it's not useful or anything, just raise your hand and yell at me and we can just make this kind of conversational, because I think that may actually kind of lend itself somewhat, because I'm kind of looking at how I would interpret this if this was laid before me and I had to meet these requirements. So that's kind of my approach and my thoughts. So that said, I will try to be somewhat vendor agnostic. So I work for a vendor, so it's kind of obvious, right? So I get subjected to a lot of Kool-Aid. I'll try to keep it down. There are some parts where there's a couple slides where we talk about, we'll go through that. But anyway, you can also raise your hand and call me out on that, but I think I'll try to keep all that kind of stuff to a minimum and kind of talk about the technical requirements, which you can meet with various tools or things like that. So SIM 5355 alpha, I think we were good there. So the main kind of pieces when you break this out, there's in section 2 that really talks about the minimum requirements. There's 5 different sections. I left out E or echo because it's questions, so there's not much there. So detection and protection, investigative, containment and remediation. I actually kind of think personally, and this is, again, maybe a little bit of Kool-Aid, but I actually think investigative is really important, because if you don't have the data to back up an investigation, then you may not have the foundational base to actually do the detection and the prevention, right? So this is an opinion, so that it's completely transparent about that, but my opinion is that if you rely on a detection technology to start collecting additional data, because we saw something evil, now we want to ramp up collection, so now we have the ability to investigate that specific thing, that works well, except if you miss something. If you don't detect something and you need to go back and you need to do any kind of proactive threat hunting, or you need to do other things, which I think are in some of the, as we go through the lines, I think some of the things call for those capabilities anyway. So the ability to hunt and things actually requires, or depends upon you collecting data all the time. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So anyway, so I think that broad foundational layer of visibility is kind of important to then build detections, and the highest fidelity detections, then you can actually prevent, right? If you think that this maybe looks suspicious, but you're not confident enough in it to just block it because you could impact business, then that's not really going to be suitable for prevention. So there'll be a lot of things you can prevent, but maybe not everything. Containment and remediation, we'll kind of go through those. So this will take me, and so apologize because there's a little bit of the Ovaltine, and no disrespect to Ovaltine or Nestle Corporation for using that line from Christmas Story, but so this is a little bit of the Ovaltine piece here, because this is something from Crowdstrike, right? So we have this endpoint solution, right? So we're a cloud-based SaaS kind of provider, and we built out this massive graph to collect this endpoint data. While we were building out that graph, we also have a services arm, and a threat intelligence research organization. So both kind of a formal intel collection capability, both collection and analysis cells and so on. Every year we publish this global threat report, and I thought it kind of tied in interestingly, and that's why I kind of brought this in. So this year's threat report's the first time we ever did kind of scoring of adversaries. We'll talk about that. One of the things we talk about in that report is what we're calling the 1-10-60 rule. So effectively, our metrics are going to be time to detect, a time to investigate, and a time to remediate. It's things that if you can measure those things, and then our goal, which we base on what we're seeing in the wild from adversarial behavior, detect intrusions in under a minute is like a goal, right? Something to try to be able to pursue anyway. Be able to perform a full investigation in under 10 and eradicate the presence of an adversary basically within 60 minutes. And some of the reasons for that, my next slide, and I'll apologize for this slide too, because I put all this in, and this is part of the threat report, and then I was like, it's just too busy, it's not really suitable for the slide. But I wanted to talk about our threat actor naming real quickly so the next kind of slides make sense. But when I got rid of the other piece, the slide looked unbalanced, so I just left it in there. So just pay attention to the part on the left, and that'll be great. But effectively, I don't know if anyone's heard of of our adversarial naming. So the ones that are probably the most well publicized would be like Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear with the DNC. Anyway, regardless, That's part of our naming convention, and we call Russian Federation, nation state, targeted intrusion actor groups, BEAR. Panda would be a Chinese nation state actor. Kitten would be Iranian, and you can see them all here. The ones that aren't geographically specific, not part of a nation state adversary, would be basically the hacktivist activists, and we kind of lump all those under Jackal, would be kind of the nomenclature. So Gecko Jackal would be like Lizard Squad, for example. And then we have Spider, which is just the part on the left, the part on the right. Just kidding. Spider is how we actually identify e-crime or financially motivated threat actors. So we track, I think it's 126 different groups right now. And what we did in this particular threat report is we started to measure what we call their breakout time. So the time from initial compromise of a host, and this will tie back into the compliance in a minute, so bear with me here. So the breakout time is the time from initial compromise of a host to a lateral movement, from when they move to another host, and that's when things generally become something. An incident starts to become a breach, right? When there's lateral movement and they start really getting a foothold in an environment. So we measured that for the first time across all the adversaries. Things actually got a little slower this year, but our fastest adversaries are still quite fast. So the spiders, the financially motivated, the criminal actors, 9 hours, 42 minutes, and 23 seconds was the average across all of the cases we investigate. And we have services, and we do have our sensor, right, our endpoint capability. And so we're measuring telemetry data all the time for millions of endpoints, so we have really good visibility into things that are going on. So when we see these types of things, our Overwatch team, these threat hunters, all this stuff, again, I'll try to keep the Oval team back, but the idea being we have a lot of visibility into what's going on, so it's a pretty complete picture of what we're seeing in the wild. So Kittens, the Iranian nation-state actors, this is it's gonna be recorded too, so I don't know if so one of the, and it's his fault. But, so basically the Kittens are, we actually name them after an animal, like a national animal. So it would have been a Persian cat was the idea at the time. And I think it was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek dig because at the time, I don't think their cyber capabilities were assessed to be as mature or capable as others. So Kitten, I think, was kind of a little bit of a dig. But I don't know that's the case anymore. They've actually kind of, they have a lot of tradecraft and they're doing a lot of interesting things. So Kittens were 5 hours. Pandas, 4 hours. So the Chinese were actually a little bit more methodical, a little bit slow for lateral movement once they got a toehold. There's a lot of different actor groups within China, though. So, I mean, they're acting upon different goals, and they may be casting broader nets, and they may be taking their time once they get a toehold somewhere before they actually really start working it. The Cholima is our North Korean adversarial group, and they're actually quite a bit faster at 2 hours and 20 minutes. And the Bears, the Russian Federation, the average was 18 minutes and 49 seconds to actually achieve lateral movement. So that is by far orders of magnitude faster than the others. And even at the 110-60 rule, if you're looking for 60 minutes for full eradication, that's fine, but you're going to have to already be in process by the time that 18 minutes triggers. So there's I'm going to reiterate it, but effectively the reason I bring this whole thing up is because I think it actually maps kind of interestingly. And when we talk about certain kinds of goals, and again, I'm doing this from a technologist kind of perspective, and we will go line by line here, but basically, the ability to detect is our first metric, so that's kind of the detection capability. The ability to investigate is the Bravo section, investigation. Containment and remediation. Containment's probably kind of bridging between the investigative and the remediation, but then there's time to remediate. So it actually kind of maps well. This is Ovaltine. I'm going to skip right past it, but basically we map this through, and of course the Falcon platform is actually a pretty capable product, and that's why I came here when I did almost 4 years ago. We mapped, and we actually think we have an argument to say we complete every one of these in a single sensor deployment. So now I'll stop talking about that. So this is going to get super line by line of the compliance. So I don't know, this may be what you guys are used to, but for me, this is like, I hope it's not too laborious for you guys. So we're going to go through the first one. So utilize both signatures and signatureless for detection and prevention. So no manual scanning of endpoints. Okay, so my first, my little crib notes on the side to remind me, what are the points that I thought? When I looked at this, the first thing I thought is why signatures, right? So if I'm taking a signature, I'm looking for an ASCII string, and I'm content scanning an entire file, or if I'm looking for a certain hex sequence or things like that, I have a signature. Well, then that's what I think of like a legacy traditional signature-based AV. So, okay. Is a behavioral model of malicious behavior. We see a PowerShell process make a network call, then execute something in memory right after that maybe looks like Mimikatz. Maybe we see interaction with LSAS, looks to be credential theft. Is the fact that we're looking at those behavioral patterns, is that actually a signature? Maybe it is, and maybe that then you could make, I think I would try to make that argument if I didn't rely on a I don't say legacy, but basically a signature matching like you'd have a traditional AV. I think if you're trying to move away from that and get something with ML or something that's maybe a little more effective, that I would make that argument that, okay, these kinds of maybe hash lookups, is that a signature? I think some people could say it is. I think that you could make an argument for that and say that you're actually meeting that requirement. I'll do it really quick, and I've got to watch my time because I go through these line by line. But one of the pros and cons, I think, of ML is, so everyone's, it's all magical, right? So you have this black box, and it tells you if a file is good or bad, right? So you do that by extracting features. You take a look at a static binary, and you pull out information from the PE header. You take all these attributes, and we have hundreds or even 1,000 or more different attributes of a file, and you feed that into a machine learning engine. And the ML will be trained. You'll give it millions of samples. Here's bad files, known bad files. Here's a ton of good files. And then it kind of starts to learn. And it gets to decide, okay, the likelihood that this given file is good or bad based upon what we've seen in the past and all of these, this feature vector, this feature fingerprint that we see is X. And it's generally, for us, and I think everyone, it's a scale of 0 to 1. It's a binary decision. So you've got 0 is 100% clean, 1 is 100% bad, and it's usually going to be like 0.9837 or something like that. And then depending on how you tune that and everything else, is that good or bad? And when you get a conviction, you get this file was bad, it was detected, it was prevented, whatever it may be, but then that's what you get. That's it. So then there's different workflows like, well, what does that mean? So if you have a signature and you're lucky enough to actually find something that it matches, then you probably know that this particular thing is this thing. This is BokBok. This is this particular piece of Samus ransomware or what have you. But with the ML engine, you just get this conviction. So there are things you can do about sandboxing and other things you can do to start to try to find related malware families and things like that. It's usually a manual exercise. There are some approaches around that. But that is one of the things that signatures can do. But again, I think for the most part, you'll see more products moving toward like ML for detection of malware, right? Files, or if they're good or they're bad. And so that would be one thing. I would probably try to make the argument that a signature, the hash lookup, and/or behavioral kind of match of basically indicators of an attack, that would actually could be considered a signature for the purposes of this. And scanning FC impact, I think everyone, when you go through the full content of a file, that can be impactful. So, second line, marching through. Everything, so how are we doing? Is this all right? Or any questions or thoughts, or you want to talk? All right, I'm going to keep marching through. So real-time on-agent prevention and detection with a new constant remote. Okay, so this is one thing with, especially like cloud vendors, right? So we're a cloud, a cloud SaaS kind of offering, right? Nothing on-premise. You put the sensor out there and you deploy these hosts. So do you require connectivity? Somebody's on a plane, or somebody is not connected to the internet, and they plugging a flash drive into their host, things like that. I think that's kind of the spirit of what this is looking for. I kind of bring, okay, so what is real time? Later in the guidance, it actually talks about near real time, which I think is a better, again, as a kind of an OCD nerd. I like to the precision of the language. So it's technically, I don't think anything is real time, but near real time, right? So basically, we're able to provide protection on the host, so on agent. So we're not relying completely on cloud lookups. I think it makes sense to leverage cloud capability if you're connected, but you need to be able to fall back. And so the idea being, so for like an ML engine, you'd have an on-sensor ML engine, right? You want to be able to do your feature extraction and your ML decision making on the host. That may not be your first line. Maybe you want to leave the heavy lifting to some kind of cloud connectivity, but when that doesn't exist, then you need to be able to protect the host, because it could be, flash drive or what have you when the host is not connected. So I think that's kind of what that means, and I think you'll see that in a lot of products. So fair there. Detection. That's the one thing. So if you detect something, if you prevent something, that makes perfect sense, right? We want to stop this evil behavior, or we want to stop this evil binary, whatever it is. You want to stop that. That's fine. But if you have a detection and you pop up a systray, what does that mean? Is the user's going to just reboot their machine? Because that's what what else do they do? So when the host does reconnect, then I think ideally you'd want that data flushed out. And again, I think probably every vendor will do this, I would hope. But so basically you'll want to flush that back out to the cloud so you get that detection information to your SOC or to whoever is actually triaging these alerts. Remote connectivity, so we're a cloud vendor. So basically if you have some kind of a cloud thing where the ingestion brokers and all the communication from all the endpoints goes up to something on the internet where all they need is internet connectivity, then that's convenient insofar as you don't require them to have VPN connectivity, you don't require them to be on a corporate network behind a perimeter, right? So if they're in the corporate network, that's great. You have a lot of ability to communicate with them and protect them with all kinds of various network countermeasures and what have you. If they're off network, then do they have to VPN in to have this data come in, or do you have just public-facing services that are listening from callouts from them? So there's some architectural pieces to that, so I think to consider, but regardless. And then Same thing with updates. So if updates means like software updates, I think every vendor is going to have that. If it's signature-based updates, ML models are usually going to be updated less frequently. So maybe every few months, month to 6 months or whatever, because their efficacy generally lasts longer based upon their training. There's always going to be new samples and new things coming out, but they'll continue to learn. So you will update them occasionally. Signature-based, you may have a gig file to upload every day, and that will actually impact some of the resource requirements, which is in a further one. So my thoughts on Alpha 2. Alpha 3, utilize artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence can be pretty broadly defined, and I think almost every vendor is using that term. I guess that's nice insofar as you can make the argument, oh yeah, it's AI because it's on all of the glossy materials and on the websites. But anyway, so AI is a whole thing in and of itself. But prevent and detect abnormalities and attempted exploits, including zero-day. And then in parents, so the zero-day is never before seen malware, excuse me. So I think of zero-day, this is one I took issue with, and it's, again, maybe just OCD nerd nonsense, but effectively, I think of zero-day, and if you look it up in Wikipedia, I think there is they make an allowance, I guess, for malware. So it's a malicious sample that's never been seen before. So zero-day generally, though, would mean there's a vulnerability that on the day that it's known, right, the day zero, it's become known to the community, it's become known to the vendor, what have you, and there's exploitation happening on day zero. So a lot of times the way you find out is somebody's discovered a flaw in an Apache web server, and they start exploiting it, and that's day zero. So they're leveraging a zero-day exploit against a zero-day vulnerability exploit. So that's kind of what I think that means. So anyway, their wording's a little maybe awkward there, but I think the spirit of it, though, kind of I think still makes sense. Attacks and use indicators of compromise. So abnormalities, I think there are some interesting things you can do with statistical anomaly detection. So you'll see some of the user behavior analytic kind of things, pieces like that where you can actually look for behavioral differences. That can be a challenge. You need a lot of data and you need some models that actually do some interesting things there. But abnormalities, again, from an efficacy perspective, I think some of the statistical anomaly detection can be useful. But I think even short of that, I think you could still meet compliance. But even if you say your ML engine looks for something, it could be abnormal in the way that this binary looks. So you could probably still, and you could call the ML AI, even though, I don't know, it's kind of a stretch maybe. But exploitation attempts, talked about that, abnormalities, the zero-day, yes. The IOC versus so IOCs are really good and they're exceptionally useful, but I think a lot of times people just say, I want IOCs, and I'm going to even call looking for those threat hunting, which I think is so sweeping for IOCs is great, but it's kind of looking in the rearview mirror, and you're looking for just that, indicators of compromise. So you're seeing artifacts that evil has transpired in the past, and then you're going to broaden out your search based upon that. You're not really looking like in real time for what you would expect the actual attack to be doing as it's happening. You're looking for things left behind. So you got some breadcrumbs in the snow, and then you've got to kind of go and recreate that entire thing. So again, IOCs are really useful, but I don't think that's the only. Yeah, I think it's an over-leveraged term. But again, I think meeting this one to make a valid argument that you're compliant with this is probably relatively easy. The AI part, because every vendor claims it basically, so I think you can just leverage what the vendor's saying and probably make that defensible. What it really means, I don't know. Detect and prevent memory-based and or fileless attacks. So this is, we talked before there was zero-day malware. So it's a malicious file. So you've got a file, you run it, it does bad things, it's malware, it's a malicious piece of software, fine. We do see a ton of living off of the land when we actually see some of those adversaries we talked about before. Effectively, a Chinese nation-state actor, there are some that will leverage, certain adversaries we know. There's like certain Iranian actors have a real affinity toward Crowdstrike. They really like that tool, and there's certain. So we'll see certain kinds of commercial and Mimikatz. You'll see everyone use that. That's fine, but effectively. Using the tools that already exist. If I'm going to run Mimikatz, I don't need a Mimikatz binary. I'll just use a PowerSploit module or Empire or something like that, and I will run Mimikatz functionality within a known good thing, right? So the program that's running is PowerShell or it's WMI or some scripting engine is what's running. It's known, it's trusted. It's the behavioral way that. So PowerShell shouldn't really be. Interacting with LSASS in a way that looks like it's stealing credentials. That's not normal, that behavioral piece. So that's what we kind of see in the ability to protect against that. I think you'll see more and more of that. So if you look for any kind of script control, if you look for anything talking about behavioral analysis, and vendors will specifically call out fileless, right? So if you see that kind of thing, I think those capabilities, again, you could have a defensible argument that you're meeting that compliance. And it is useful because, again, we don't see just malware being used in attacks. I mean, you'll see commodity stuff and you get a ransomware sample, things like that. Somebody clicked on a link, whatever. It's non-targeted. It's not super exciting. I mean, it's not unexciting if you're the one having to deal with it. But it's it's not a sophisticated adversary, specifically targeting your environments generally. When you see those kinds of things, hand-on keyboard types of adversaries, you'll see a lot more of the fileless piece and living off the land, so they try to blend right in and look like normal users. The ability to prevent that behaviorally is a nice one, right? So if ntds.dits, the Active Directory database, if you see a shadow volume snapshot like created, you see a backup, a Windows backup being created, then you see that file copy out of that, because you can't copy it out of the real one, but you can copy it out of the backup. I mean, that behaviorally, that looks really suspicious, but you're using all built-in commands of Windows. You're just using the operating system, but you're using it in a way that the IT department probably hopes it's not being used. System behavior, we talked about that. So 5, moving right along. Is it exciting yet, or not so much? The bar's already open if you guys want to leave now. All right. I'll keep going. Again, I'm not an auditor, so I apologize. My attention span's usually super short, so. All right, so SIM integrations, right? So you're going to have your own logging solutions. You're going to have your incident event management kind of platforms. You're going to want things to integrate. Everyone's going to do this. You're going to want something that's not just an island, right? So this is probably a pretty easy one to meet compliance with. Generally speaking, the individual vendor may have SIM integrations. You may have the different SIM vendors actually having modules, right? So you go to Splunkbase and they actually have a plugin, right? They've already built a TA. They've already got an add-on for vendor X, right? And so you plug in, you put in your credentials or whatever. It'll generally talk to some kind of API, especially if it's a cloud vendor, which I think a lot of them are doing cloud offerings, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But when you do that, the one thing I would say, so this isn't to promote us, but the idea being we have something we call a SIM connector, right? So we have a lot of integrations, and every vendor will, with various types of SIM providers. One of the things we can do though is have kind of a generic capability where we can say, okay, we'll provide you this little piece of software. You can talk to the APIs and write your own scripts, but this thing will handle all your authentication. It'll pull the stuff. It'll keep a track of offsets where it last pulled data down. So it pulls all this data, and it can do it as like JSON, so you can consume it with Splunk or something or whatever you want, flat files, or you can pipe it out as like a syslog stream, and that's really cool. But just the one thing to be careful with on that is depending if you have like maybe a cloud-based SIM or what have you, you don't necessarily want to be streaming those logs because it's going to be unencrypted. Just 514 UDP by default. It's going to be just a clear stream of the event data. You probably don't want that going to some kind of so just the placement and the architecture, and that's just another thing I would think about as I'm looking. Okay, how do I actually want to get this data in? As long as the SIM lives near, or the SIM itself is doing the API calls, that's going to all be generally encrypted, like TLS connections to something. You're pulling all that data down in an encrypted fashion. That's fine. If you're using a shim or some kind of middleware to go and grab that data, just that last haul, you might want to make sure you could do it with VPN wrapping or whatever as well. But there's anyway another maybe possible consideration. And then also CDT. Let's see. So, and then similarly, I would think that any kind of multi-tenant thing, and there's some talk about multi-tenant specifically, but the ability to consume those, like in this case, like cloud logs, to be able to pull those from multiple points, right? So if you have that little SIM connector thing, if it's keeping track of its own bookmark, then that's great. You can have 3 of them running. They're all 3 just watching the logs as they come in, and they're keeping track of the last log each of them got independent of one another. If something says it sends the log one time, and then you have to have some kind of a broker that then is going to split it across or whatever, that's just another like architectural thing I might keep in mind. It's probably not a big deal. I think a lot of vendors you'll be able to do something like that with, if it's cloud-based, right? If it's an on-premise kind of management, similarly, you could probably pull the logs once and divvy it up however you'd like. But yeah, RBAC, it's the same thing, the detection data. So some of the RBAC, there are certain, sometimes with APIs, if you have a single set of credentials for the entire organization, that's one thing, but ideally you might want to be able to have certain kinds of credentials or different types of credentials that you can control with a little more granularity, especially if you have partners, CDT, SOC, or other kinds of places where you have kind of control of the data and who's actually has access to that. And not just for log data, but really for all the capabilities you might have access to programmatically through APIs. Centralized software distribution process updates and integration with existing distribution solutions. So yeah, ease of deployment. So basically, how do you deploy the solution, right? Is it an MSI, is it an exe, is it PKJ files or .debs or .rpms for Linux? How are you actually doing that? And do you have existing infrastructure in place? Most every organization is going to have some way that they distribute and manage software, as long as it plays nicely with that. That's probably not a really high bar to entry on that one. Then you could look at the size of the installer and the requirements from the network and things like that. But generally speaking, that shouldn't be too bad. The security information updates and software updates, depending, right? So I would say for me, I would look for a solution where I could leverage my own existing software distribution system and push out updates by just uploading a package. Maybe I require that, right? So that I would want that capability. It's I think a nice to have if the vendor also supports either both or either, where you could say, well, I want the cloud, the cloud or this whatever this other thing is to update the software for me, or to allow that to happen, right? If you do allow for like cloud updates, so new version of something comes out, the hosts see them. If you have any kind of change control, the ability to like pin that or actually control when those hosts update, just not immediately, I think is important. Also, the ability, and I think you probably have to talk to the vendors about this, but effectively, the way that those updates will happen, like if you have 10,000 endpoints behind a single, network egress point, so you got, a big firewall cluster, whatever else, you have tons of hosts behind this, are they all going to go grab that, that update simultaneously? So maybe like a random polling interval when they're checking for that, so they don't all find out about the update at once. And then similarly, if it's being provided by any kind of a cloud engine or some kind of centralized repository, even on the LAN, do you have a way to throttle that and say only service like 100 requests at a time or 1,000 requests at a time or whatever it may be, so that you're actually not choking out any network circuits. Cloud-based backend centralized. Same thing with a VPN. If you're actually doing where if you have endpoints that are connected in, do they have to have some kind of encrypted tunnel back into your backend? If you're actually pulling it from like an on-prem, but any remote endpoints, they have to be tunneled in. And, just architectural considerations around that. Again, I think you can meet the requirements and say I'm compliant relatively easily, but how it actually is from an ease of operations perspective for the IT staff is maybe a different thing. Any questions on any so far? I'm just blathering on. It's all good. All right, cool. 7. So this one, support endpoints located on-premise or agents deployed in a cloud platform. So the off-premise one, I think and again, that's a little bit of my leaning, I guess, right, or my bias. But so I think of a lot of these things being useful in a kind of a cloud, like a SaaS delivered model. Similarly, though, like I've mentioned multiple times, if you don't have that, you may have VPN capabilities, or you may have some kind of publicly exposed services where the actual endpoints can actually connect back in and get that information. So we kind of talked about that a little bit. I think pretty much every vendor will support some kind of flavor of that, right? Even if you have to do the network plumbing independently, it could be independent of the solution. It may not be the endpoint that does that. If it's a cloud provider, it's kind of taken care of. Deploying as cloud infrastructure, so there will be certain integrations that some vendors can have with AWS or Azure or Google Cloud Platform, things like that. Generally speaking, though, I think every solution, because you're generally going to be virtualizing operating systems that you're running your productivity stuff on, and those are the operating systems, those are the ways that the sensor is going to work anyway, or the agent's going to work. So for the most part, being on a virtual system, regardless of the cloud provider, shouldn't really be an issue. I do think there's one thing I put, one thing I think, this is again nerdy, so I apologize if the wrong audience or not, but the one thing that a lot of people want is like hypervisor integration. So you actually run the endpoint protection, or run it within the hypervisor, which is cool and architecturally seems very elegant. But one of the things I think you'll find is that the level of detail that you get may not really fit that investigative requirement from the B section. So you'll have information about file operations, but you probably aren't going to have information about, from a Windows perspective, like registry operations, scheduled tasks, firewall modifications. A lot of that detail you probably need to be in the kernel. And again, there's one about performance or resources that we'll stumble across as we go through. But basically, if you have modern solutions are generally going to be very lightweight in comparison to what you might think of the traditional scanning signature-based AV. So when you look at that kind of performance implication, generally running in the kernel of even, I've seen it in 10,000 nodes of VDI, running simultaneously in a VDI cluster, they're coming up and down constantly. It generally really isn't a performance impact that's even measurable. It's probably measurable, but it's not noticeable by most organizations. So I actually think that within the guest kernel is a better place to maybe be than in hypervisor. Tiered management with multi-tenancy. So this will be important for the CDT piece, right? So they're talking about having, so if they have a SOC and they want some overarching kind of a piece, this can be interesting to, how's that implemented? Let me see what refresh my memory, the hunting capabilities. So this is going to be an easy one to ask a vendor, and they'll say yes or no, right? Or they'll have some way that they can approach this. So basically, if you have your environment, you've got 10 agencies or 150 agencies, whatever it is, and every one of them has their own instance of something. If you have a partner or CB or CDT or whatever, if they're actually connecting to that data, they're going to want a way to hunt across the entirety of all of those and be able to go in and have some kind of management or some kind of access to all those environments. The individual, I would think, the agencies will probably own the data and own their own instance, but you'll have to have some kind of way. So maybe RBAC, same kind of thing. Maybe is it read-only access? Do they have the ability to go in and remediate hosts like the Charlie and Delta? Can they contain your hosts? Can they, so there's a lot of considerations there, and I think that's maybe more of an an internal, that's one I can't speak to, right? Like internal political and everything else. What kind of a relationship would you have with some kind of a central SOC? But the ability to support that, I think you'll find that in various vendors, but I think they'll all do it somewhat differently. So it's probably a worthwhile conversation to have when you're looking at a specific vendor or who you're interested in. 9, let's see, how am I doing here? I've got 15, okay, I'll race through. Detect user access levels on endpoints. So basically the ability to do some monitoring of user behaviors, right? So what types of accounts are being used? Are these local accounts? Are they domain accounts? Do they have administrative privileges, highly privileged accounts being used inappropriately? Sometimes that's just people doing regular work under administrative accounts, right? The ability to see that data, I think, is what it's asking for here. One thing that it doesn't specifically mention, but failed logon attempts, right? So we're looking at user behaviors. So failed logon attempts is a nice event type to be able to capture, as well as successful logon events, really. And then tying processes and their behaviors. So I see, DNS queries to evil.ru or what have you, to be able to tie that to individual users. I think that should be kind of part and parcel and pretty common across most products, but that would be something I would look for, especially in relation to this. I want to see these user behaviors, so I want to see user accounts tied to the various behaviors we see emanating from processes on hosts. Let's see, near real. So now we use the term near real time. So pardon me. An endpoint inventory. So it's pretty easy to say if I have 10,000 endpoints in my environment and I deploy sensors to 9,000, there's a 1,000 unmanaged. I know about the 9,000. That should be table stakes. That's pretty easy to do. They do talk about, I think there's a future one that talks about rogue detection. And applications and versions of applications. So that's another nice thing. So if I have presence on an endpoint, I can actually tell you everything that's running on the endpoint, what's installed on the endpoint. If I do that based upon versions, then you can ask, like in a Windows host, you can ask the registry, like what's installed and what are the versions of everything. It's maybe nice to also see the hashes of the files that are running, so you can say, is this really what's running? Even though it's not, something proclaims it's version this, you can actually validate that. If you do know everything running on the host, especially like hash-based or whatever, then maybe a nicety or something would be, you could start to map that to vulnerabilities, right? So you could say, well, I actually know that these things are running in my environment, and these things actually have known vulnerabilities for these versions. So having that inventory, I think what they're leaning toward is then being able to map that manually. That might be something you could, ask a vendor if they could do it for you and how they would approach that. It may not always, there may be challenges to that, but that would be a nice to have, I think, as far as that goes. Something else, and I don't know if it happens on this slide or an upcoming one, but we'll just, actually, wait, never mind. It is the next one, the rogue endpoint. So if I have a presence on those 9,000 hosts and there's 1,000 that I don't know about, and maybe there's 10 more that, somebody like me just walked in with a laptop and plugged into a, something in a conference room or what have you. So I've got these, rogue endpoints or just unmanaged endpoints where I don't have an agent installed. The ability to detect that. So I think you could kind of approach that from like a network scanning perspective. So you can go out and look. And then depending on how distributed a network is, right? If you have 100 locations or, then do you actually need a scanning presence in every one of those? Or do you scan through like some kind of a VPN tunnel or what have you to actually find those? And what's the frequency? How regularly can you update that? A different approach is actually doing some passive monitoring, right? So you can do that again from a network perspective and just look for traffic on the wire. You can, something we've done, again, a little bit of Ovaltine here, but so is actually start to look at the ARP tables and look at all of the layer 2 broadcast domain peers that you see on every one of your managed endpoints, and then start to correlate that back and determine, okay, of all of these things that we see on these networks, how many of these do we know don't have a sensor installed? And then the additional challenge for that becomes, well, are they on a corporate network where 1,000 sensors saw this one unmanaged host, or they see, is it a Roku or an Apple TV in someone's home network, or are they in a coffee shop? So then being able to even assess confidence, it can be very interesting. But rogue network, rogue detection, I think those are kind of the two approaches, and you could have either or both or a combination. I think still say that you match it again, even if it's just passive network detection or if you're doing something with active scanning. Current releases of Windows and Linux, I think it seems reasonable. I mean, legacy OS versions, I do think for the best visibility from the investigative for the Bravo section, I think kernel-based visibility is going to give you like very high fidelity visibility and a lot of information. To be able to run in an unsupportable operating system, XP or things like that. So legacy OS has become really a challenge from that perspective. Sometimes you can find vendors if you have, you have needs, you have to run a certain application or something and it requires legacy OS. You'll see sometimes if it can run any kind of an agent or any kind of an endpoint security piece, then a lot of times the capabilities of it will be greatly diminished compared to its more modern counterparts on the same network. So you can have a sensor from vendor X, and they'll have actually a different sensor entirely that might run on those. So that'd be something I'd be aware of. Otherwise, you'll see a lot of microsegmentation, right? If you have like IoT types of devices, and I think that's a one they talk about, or different types of things that cannot run any kind of an agent, then microsegmentation or different network countermeasures kind of become the piece. So, okay. 10 minutes. The guy's supposed to show me a sign. Let's see if that's him. 10 minutes. Thanks. So a few optional, so there's some optional ones in the off section. I'm going to kind of go quickly here as we go through. So basically, resource utilization, so it should be lightweight. I would look at CPU utilization, RAM and disk footprints, and of course the network piece. Especially if it's cloud-based, I would look at how much total bandwidth this thing is using, especially if it's streaming telemetry data up in real time or near real time, all of the time, not just based upon detection events. So those are the kinds of things I would measure. You have specific measurements here, so that you can certainly use those. I think 3% while it's active, it'd be interesting to see, right? It depends on if it's normal utilization or if you're doing some kind of one of the guys calls it a malware fiesta, right? Where you just detonate 1,000 samples at once, all in parallel. I think you're going to see some interesting results from pretty much every vendor on the 3% piece. But normal active utilization, 3% seems pretty generous, really. So anyway, but you have guidance there, and those are the things I'd look at. In addition, I would look at network. Yeah. Update, upgrade, install without reboot. I think you'll find that should be pretty readily available. Also potentially uninstallation, mostly uninstalled anyway. Some things you can probably uninstall and this will be some remnants, but that would be another thing to maybe consider. But yeah, obviously you want to be able to deploy something and not have it be impactful and require reboots everywhere. OS X, Linux and Unix. So Mac OS, I think you're going to see most vendors able to do that. It's probably not going to be hard one. It's an optional one anyway. The other Unixes could be interesting. Bsd, Solaris. There's so many different flavors. And again, if you're in the kernel, it's going to be pretty specific versions and things you can support. If you're in user space, you might be able to do some things and be a little more broad. But again, it's kind of that trade-off: the level of granularity, the level of information you have and you can leverage, versus the number of things, the number of kernels, the number of OSs you can support. On-premise, off-premise protection, non-traditional. Internet of Things and mobile. So you'll see some things in mobile. Mobile's an interesting one because you have things that are battery constrained and you have things that are network constrained, right? So how do you actually approach that? Is it EDR? Are you going to stream all the data like you do on a traditional endpoint? Or are you going to actually wrap applications? There's different approaches to that. We got some interesting things we're starting to do in mobile, but again, that's an interesting one. IoT is going to be tough because generally you're going to have very little resource to leverage and you're going to have kind of closed systems. There may be a Linux system you can do something with, but I'm glad it's in the optional because that would be a hard one to effectively do. I think you'll see on the IoT, you'll probably see a lot of microsegmentation and network defenses. Common popular business system, so ticketing systems, Snow, what have you. So integrations, like the same kind of thing. Or if you have you probably want to have any vendor have a reasonably rich API ecosystem, so you can actually talk in for integrations with your SIM, like before, for your ticketing systems and whatever else, right? So yeah, UBA, NAC. If you're collecting all this data, it's very valuable and it can be used for other things. So if you have an approach where the data can be used beyond the actual tool. You have all that data and you can use it. You have a single sensor deployed or a single agent deployed. You can actually leverage that and broaden that out. Ticketing systems, yeah. All right, so the investigative capabilities. So that was kind of the protective and detective capabilities. So I've got a kind of laundry list here, and I don't know if they'll make the presentation available or not, but effectively, there's a lot of different data types that are ideal to collect. So you want to know anytime a process spawns on a host, and you want to know what happens from that process. Does it make network calls? Does it do name resolution? Is it writing files to disk? Is it reading files? Is it, all of that kind of information can be very useful, right? So maybe you're looking for data exfiltration. Having that kind of data available is great. If you're streaming that data out and you have all this eventing data coming back, having the ability to query that's maybe an architectural thing also. If you can ask a repository about that data without relying on the endpoints being online and all asking each other, I think that can be useful. If the hosts have to be online, or if a system gets blown away or re-imaged or what have you, VDI system gets is reset, then you can lose a lot of that data. And the ability to actually do a lot of immediate kind of triaging, I think can be pretty useful. But I kind of race through, looking at my clock here. Following scanning capabilities. So again, if you're doing this searching, how can you do it, right? The ability to search for arbitrary data, I think, does really help infuse threat hunting. So and generally, I don't think of hunting as like IOC sweeps. I think of it as looking for something that's not detected. So we didn't see the malware, and I've got customers or and friends and stuff that are doing things like where I'm looking for like net commands, right? And that happens all the time and it's legitimate, so it'll false positive all day long. But they'll say, I want to see every use of any net command, and I want to see when anybody runs system info or ipconfig, things that are just normal tools and really not, they're pretty benign, really. But when I see them, they'll actually start building queries in like an EDR tool and say, I want to see the frequency of those. And when they're from the same parent shell or the same parent command line, I want to see when all those are together, because the likelihood that something is evil based upon them being together grows. And so you can do some interesting things and really kind of ferret up some, it could be insider threat, it could be a lot of stuff, it could be completely legitimate, but you can find some really interesting things. And so hunting for hands-on keyboard people doing stealthy things is actually kind of is nice. And the ability to do ad hoc searching, I think, really does empower that.
Is regex kind of included as Yara type searches as well?
So, and because it specifically says regex, right? So is it PCRE or what can you do? I would say that you can support that in there, and if you can do, and so if Yara hunts are part of the tool's capabilities, then I could say you can make that argument. And is it? Let's see. And it says and value search. Yeah. So it does say and, right? So we were talking about the semantics earlier. So file, and what is file searching, right? Is it by the hash is already said next to it? Is it the file name? I guess it is. A regex for what, right? So I think you can make the argument you're compliant in a lot of ways if there's any PCRE capability anywhere in the product, but yeah, it's somewhat vague. I would say yes, personally. All right, tagging, let's see, hunting via integrated event collection. I'm gonna race through. Support root cause. Okay, so again, effectively, if you have the ability to see what was transpiring in the host, you can go back, you can hunt that data, the ability to visualize that and start to see that, and you'll see that in most products will have some kind of a flow, right, where you'll actually be able to see this process did these things, here's the behaviors, here's the children processes, the parents and grandparents of all those things. I do think the ability, I don't know if it's this one or not, but to actually start to do some timelines, that might be the next one. But basically to start doing some where you look at events and see everything coming in chronologically, like you would do, from old forensic disk images back, 10, 15 years ago. Same thing with memory analysis. When you start to see things chronologically and lump all that together, it can help you ferret things out. And the ability to visualize that, you'll probably see in most tools. I don't know about the timelining, but that might be something I would kind of dig into a little bit. Provide pre-made analysis reports. I think this is going to be part and parcel. It's going to be pretty easy to find. You're going to have dashboards and pre-built reports. The ability to export the data out and use your own kind of reporting tools. And then we have the optionals. So centralized management console, fine. Let's see, remote endpoints. We've already kind of covered this. We're talking about the VPN piece. If you have a remote host versus cloud advantages there. Visual browser-based. Yeah, nothing's really fat clients anymore. Pretty much everything is going to be HTML, just like everyone's email and text is, chatting is now too. SMTP, IRC, everything is over web now. So CLI access, the old people like me who want CLI access, that's generally going to be achievable through those APIs anyway. But yeah, everyone's going to have a web UI, I think. Virtual asset tagging, I have no opinion on this. Sounds nice. So depending on what that is that based upon you want to put arbitrary tags on assets in the management console to be able to refer to them? Is that for grouping? Is that for based upon OU membership or dynamically based on some kind of attributes of the host? There's probably a lot of ways you could do that, and again, it's listed as optional. Timeline threat graphic views, deliver guided investigation. Guided investigation, there was an earlier talk, they talked about MITRE framework. Using frameworks or the ability to show objectives and tactics and techniques and kind of map those together can a lot of times give people information about what an adversary is likely up to at a given stage of an attack based upon what you're seeing. Any kind of handrails like that to help guide an investigation I think could be useful, and you'll probably see that in quite a few vendors. And you can also start to leverage some open frameworks like from MITRE and things like that. Okay, containment. So I think it's important to be able to network isolate a host, and I think this is what the guidance is basically saying. You should be able to network isolate a host, kind of stop the bleeding, right? You're triaging something, you want to stop the pain right now. Can you automate that? Can you do that through APIs, things like that? If you can, do you have RBAC around that and strict auditing and capabilities to prevent somebody from getting access to that and containing all of your hosts simultaneously and shutting down an entire organization? Can the containment survive a reboot? That's one thing that's kind of interesting. I've seen that not happen. So that's one thing I would test, right? If you contain an asset, the end user has been trained. When your machine doesn't work, you reboot it at least 4 times and then everything's gonna be fine. And so when they do that, if the containment falls off, that's not great. So that's one thing I would test. But I think it's relatively self-explanatory. You should be able to have it talk back to some kind of cloud infrastructure or whatever it is so you can do the next phase, which subsection D is the remediation. So you want to actually be able to go and interact with that host. You're going to want to be able to kill processes, delete files, maybe retrieve files, maybe memory images. I think there was something about disk images. Disk images is kind of a huge one. So, I mean, I don't think you'll see a lot of disk-based forensics usually anymore. You'll do that if you're going to court or things like that typically, but generally speaking, if you already have all the eventing data and you have the ability to even capture memory images or grab files, you probably have all the information you need to be able to tell the story of what's really transpired and write your report and close your incident. And again, if you're able to modify the registry and do all these things remotely, then you can actually connect to that host and fully remediate it. They had this one here, so the complete remediation instructions, I think that's a huge, I mean, that sounds amazing, but I don't think that's real until that artificial intelligence one from earlier becomes a real thing. I mean, it's like, what does that mean? So you can have frameworks, you can have stuff around it and give you some strong guidance, but fucking platform, we have a lot of, the way we approach single sensor, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to avoid the Ovaltine because time's up, and that was it. Whew. Now I'll breathe and drink my coffee. Thank you, guys. Any questions or stuff you want to talk about in general?
So I got a quick question.
Please.
So on the scenario they had at CDOT where they literally shut down the entire network to kind of do containments, how does that work if you're dealing with cloud-based control of an ER solution?
So I'm not familiar with the specifics. So they purposefully, it wasn't in somebody okay, so they purposefully just pulled the plug on everything, isolated everything. Okay, so generally speaking, if you have a containment capability, depending on how it's implemented, and there's different ways, but typically you'll see either use of, like from a Windows perspective, the Windows firewall, or the core components within the kernel that the Windows firewall uses, making API calls to those and actually killing traffic. You'll typically, like in our case, I'll just speak for us, but I think you'll see this, I would expect you'll see this from other vendors if they're doing containment. You will whitelist certain IPs by default of your cloud infrastructure, so it can still talk to the cloud, so you still have that full visibility and can still do the remediation. Ideally, you should have the ability to do your own whitelisting for your own remediation tools, your forensic tools, whatever else, so you can actually go and talk to those things. But so typically you can do that and still maintain that connectivity and then lift the containment at the end. And hopefully, I mean, if you have to do an entire agency, then you'd want the ability to use some kind of something with APIs or whatever where you could go and contain thousands of hosts instead of the 1 and 2, which you'd hopefully see most of the time. It should be possible, but it would be terrible.
And then also, I'll just add on to that, Crowdstrike is involved with that remediation, so you can also talk to Attendees.
Yeah, I was a little bit curious.
Her experience,
And the remote containment in Crowdstrike, it's so, we do have one customer that is Crowdstrike software customer. They have, I mean, if we don't have a mobile app, but you can log into any website on your app or on your phone. So what they got a detection alert via email on their phone, saw that they had it, and they could contain a machine from their phone. And that was like soccer.
He was at a soccer game. That was a great story.
I mean, it was some sports game on the weekend, right? And so, I mean, that alone, lateral movement is, contained there.
Yes, sir.
So I had a question. As you look at the standard that the state adopted, are there any major gaps that you see there or anything where you think, they missed something here?
Honestly, I think it's a reasonably strong approach. I mean, it even has like some of the hygiene things and finding rogue assets and things like that. I thought some of the wording on like the 0 day referring to malware instead of exploitation, or things were like maybe technically for I think the idea of it though, like the one piece where we talked about the and the regex, I mean that there's some things where some of the asks, that last one where it says like complete remediation instruction, that's cool, but if you're reading that precisely to the letter, it's like, how do you even do that? I mean, how do you know if it's a real adversary? If you have a you have a snapshot or you have something you roll back to, okay, if that's what it is, but it depends, right? So I don't know. So some of the things I think are aiming pretty high, but I don't know. What do you think, Brett? Do you think there's anything glaringly missing or absent from it?
The one thing that this does not outline, which is outside the scope of this policy, is the interaction between an endpoint solution and the other solutions you'll have in your environment. So ultimately what would pair with an endpoint solution is a cloud solution that protects your cloud assets, right, exfiltration from those sources, and then something that protects your users. And so that might come at a later time. This was just published January. Sure. So I think that we won't see another one for probably at least a few years. Even meeting this bar is a large.
It's pretty substantial.
Historically, what's been involved, especially in the state and local government areas. A lot of people worked very hard to make this policy, create this policy, complete the effort there. Understanding that not a lot of people will be able to meet the policy needs like day one. For us, the conversation is really like, what other tools would an organization have, and how can we get closer to meeting the policy?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, someone can come down from CDT or someone else and claim audit compliance is not being met based on this policy. So I'd say, my gaps would be the other things that are outside endpoints.
But in terms of an endpoint standard, it's pretty adequate.
I think it's relatively complete, and I think, like Brad said, right? It's if every entity or organization, public or private, had these kinds of capabilities. I think the investigative one is really huge, right? Detection and prevention is what it is, and there will be different levels of efficacy there. But the ability to actually have that data that then helps you get to root cause, it helps you investigate things quickly, and try to get to that whole 1-10-60 rule that we were advocating. So
maybe the second part of the question for me would be, in terms of your work out in the field, do you see many even commercial entities coming close to this standard?
yes, I do see some.
Surpassing the standard. The greatest thing about this is this is basically the commercial policies that people have been following for years, and bringing it towards the public sector space was a huge advancement, as far as I'm concerned, in the security of government in general. This was a huge lift for Peter, trying to get this policy in place, and it's only been live for a few months, so not everyone's going to jump on it.
Sure.
And the policy does not say which vendors meet the policy. The policy is just the policy, right? It's up to your organization, every organization, to vet a solution against the policy and see if it meets the compliance needs, right? So, for instance, the regex stuff, there's very few tools that can do that. There's very few tools that can install without a reboot, right? And eventually someone created a tool that can meet it, right? But as of now, this was meant to cover endpoint security regardless of where the endpoint is. So it's supposed to be a policy that can map to near all the organizations within local state government.
To be fair, there are some large commercial enterprises who aren't there, though, right? It's not universal, but there I've worked with some that have very sophisticated operations, and they're still subject to attacks, right? They see a lot of stuff. So, yeah, thank you. Any other questions or thoughts or anything? Miller time. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.